The Sound of Steel Doors. My name is Marcus Thompson, and I'm writing this from inside the Riverside Correctional Facility in upstate New York, where concrete walls have become my horizon and steel bars measure the boundaries of my world. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead 24 hours a day, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that makes even the strongest man look like he's dying from the inside out. I've lost count of the days since they brought me here in shackles, the orange jumpsuit scratching against skin that hadn't seen sunlight in weeks. The judge's words still echo in my mind. 25 years to life. Each word had landed like a physical blow, and I remember how my mother's sob had cut through the courtroom silence sharper than any blade. If you believe that miracles still happen, or if you've ever experienced something that deeply touched your faith, share your story in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so we can continue walking this journey of faith together. The cell I call home is 8 feet by 10 feet of pure misery. The walls are painted that institutional green that seems designed to drain hope from your soul. There's a narrow window high up near the ceiling, but it only shows a slice of sky so small it might as well be a cruel joke. The mattress is thin as cardboard, and every spring has found a way to dig into my back during those endless nights when sleep refuses to come. My cellmate, Rodriguez, snores like a freight train every night. He's been here 15 years for armed robbery, and his skin has taken on that pale, underground quality that comes from too little sun and too much regret. We don't talk much, but sometimes in the middle of the night, I hear him crying. Soft, muffled sounds that he tries to bury in his pillow. I pretend to be asleep because a man's tears in this place are sacred, private things. The sounds here never stop. During the day, it's the constant clank of metal on metal, doors slamming, keys jangling, the scrape of chairs across concrete floors. Guards' boots echo down the corridors with military precision, and their radios crackle with codes and numbers that reduce human beings to statistics. At night, the sounds change but never disappear. Someone's always coughing, someone's always muttering prayers or curses, and the building itself seems to groan under the weight of all the broken dreams it contains. The smell is worse than the sounds. It's a mixture of industrial disinfectant, stale sweat, and something else I can't quite name. Maybe it's the smell of time itself, sitting heavy and stagnant. The food tastes like cardboard seasoned with despair, and the water from the tap has a metallic tang that reminds you that even the most basic necessities here come with a price. I was 28 when they brought me here, full of anger and convinced that the world owed me something. I had been running with a crew in Brooklyn, thinking I was smart enough to stay ahead of the law, believing that rules were for other people. The night that changed everything started like any other: whiskey, bad decisions, and the kind of pride that makes young men think they're bulletproof. Now, at 31, I can feel the years settling into my bones like sediment. My hands, once steady enough to hotwire a car in under 2 minutes, shake when I try to write letters I never send. My eyes, which used to scan every room for exits and opportunities, now mostly stare at these 4 walls that have become the entire universe. The other inmates call me Brooklyn because that's where I'm from. But that name feels like it belongs to someone else now. The Marcus Thompson who walked these streets in designer sneakers and gold chains feels like a character from a movie I watched a long time ago. That man was so sure he had life figured out, so certain that respect came from fear and success was measured in dollars and reputation. That man was a fool. In here, respect means something different entirely. It means keeping your mouth shut when you see things you shouldn't see, sharing your commissary with someone who's been forgotten by the world, and knowing when to stand up and when to step back. Success is measured in days without incident, letters from home that haven't stopped coming, and the small victories that keep your soul from shriveling up like a raisin. The days bleed into each other here. Breakfast at 6:30, work detail at 8, lunch at noon. More work. Dinner at 5 lockdown at 9, rinse and repeat over and over until the routine becomes a hypnotic rhythm that can either drive you insane or provide the only stability you have left. I chose stability because the alternative was madness, and I'd seen what madness looked like in here. It wore dead eyes and talked to walls, but late at night, when Rodriguez's snoring reaches its crescendo and the guards' footsteps fade down distant corridors, I lie on my back and stare at the ceiling where someone before me had scratched the words, "God sees everything." Those 3 words have become my meditation, my torment, and perhaps my salvation, all rolled into one. Because if God really does see everything, then he saw what I did that night in Brooklyn. He saw the choice I made, the life I took, the family I destroyed. And if he sees everything, then maybe, just maybe, he also sees me now. Lying here in this concrete tomb, finally beginning to understand what I've done. The thought terrifies me and comforts me in equal measure. Sleep, when it finally comes, brings no peace. My dreams are a highlight reel of the worst night of my life, playing over and over like a broken record that skips on the most painful parts. I wake up in cold sweats, my pillow damp with tears I don't remember crying, and for a moment I forget where I am. Then reality crashes back like a wave against rocks, and I remember that this is my life now. The night that brought me here started at Mickey's Bar on Atlantic Avenue. It was March 15th. I remember because it was 3 days after my 28th birthday, and I was still feeling invincible from all the cash we'd pulled in from our latest score. The crew was celebrating, buying rounds for everyone, acting like we owned the place. Jimmy Rodriguez, not my cellmate, different Rodriguez, was bragging about the Cadillac he'd just bought, while Tony Marcelli kept flashing this gold watch he'd lifted from some businessman in Manhattan. I should have stayed home that night. Sarah had begged me to, her green eyes pleading in that way that used to make me promise her anything. She was 8 months pregnant with our daughter, belly round and perfect, and she'd been having these dreams, nightmares. Really, about something terrible happening to me, but I was young and stupid and drunk on my own success, so I kissed her forehead and told her not to worry. "I'll be back before midnight, baby," I said, my hand resting on her belly where little Emily was kicking. "Your daddy's got business to handle." Business? What a joke. We were just a bunch of kids playing at being gangsters, thinking we were characters in a movie instead of real people with real consequences waiting around every corner. The bar was thick with cigarette smoke and cheap cologne. The jukebox played the same 3 songs over and over, Sweet Caroline, Piano Man, and some country song about lost love that made the older guys get misty-eyed. I was nursing a whiskey, feeling like the king of Brooklyn, when this guy walked in. His name was Detective Michael Patterson. Though I didn't know that at the time, all I saw was some clean-cut guy in a nice suit who looked out of place in Mickey's. He ordered a beer and minded his own business. But something about him set my teeth on edge. Maybe it was cop instinct, or maybe it was just paranoia, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching us. "You see that guy?" I whispered to Jimmy, nodding toward the end of the bar. Jimmy squinted through his beer goggles. "Yeah. What about him?" "Something's not right. Look how he's sitting, back to the wall, facing the door. That's cop posture." Tony laughed, the sound harsh and ugly. "Marcus, you're getting paranoid in your old age. Guy's probably just some accountant getting drunk after a bad day at the office. But I knew, deep in my gut, I knew we were being watched. And when Detective Patterson got up to use the bathroom, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I followed him. The bathroom at Mickey's was a disaster, cracked mirror, graffiti covering every surface, and a smell that could knock you over. Patterson was standing at the urinal, and in the mirror, our eyes met. That's when I knew for certain he was a cop, because he had that look. That careful, measuring expression that cops get when they're trying to figure out if you're worth their attention. "A nice night," he said, zipping up and moving to the sink. "Yeah, real nice," I replied, my hand already moving to the gun tucked into my waistband. What happened next lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it plays in my mind like slow motion. Patterson must have seen something in my eyes because his hand started moving toward what I now know was his service weapon. But I was young and fast, and the streets had taught me to shoot first and ask questions later. The sound of the gunshot in that small bathroom was deafening. The bullet caught him in the chest, and he went down hard, his head hitting the edge of the sink with a crack that I still hear in my nightmares. His eyes, God, his eyes. They looked so surprised, like he couldn't believe this was really happening. I stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds, watching the blood spread across his white shirt like spilled wine. He tried to say something, his mouth moving soundlessly, and I saw the wedding ring on his finger catching the fluorescent light. Then his eyes went empty, and I knew he was gone. The silence afterward was somehow worse than the gunshot. I could hear the jukebox still playing in the other room, someone laughing at a joke I couldn't make out, the normal sounds of life continuing while I stood over a dead man whose name I didn't even know. I ran, left through the back door, threw the gun in a dumpster 6 blocks away, and drove home with my hands shaking so hard I could barely steer. Sarah was asleep on the couch, one hand resting on her belly, and for a moment I thought about waking her up, telling her everything, begging her to run away with me to somewhere far from Brooklyn and Detective Michael Patterson and the choice I'd made. Instead, I covered her with a blanket and sat in my chair, staring out the window at the city lights and waiting for the cops to come. They didn't come that night, or the next day, or even that week. I started to think maybe I'd gotten away with it, that maybe no one had seen me leave the bathroom, that maybe Michael Patterson's death would become just another unsolved case in a city full of them. But guilt is a patient hunter, and fear makes you stupid. 3 weeks later, they kicked down my door at 5 in the morning. Sarah screamed as they dragged me away in handcuffs, and that sound, her voice breaking as she called my name, that's the sound I hear every night before sleep, finally claims me. Detective Patterson, I learned during the trial, was 34 years old. He'd been married for 8 years to a woman named Lisa, and they had 2 kids, a boy named Jake, who was 6, and a girl named Emma, who was 4. He'd been working undercover, trying to build a case against my crew, and that night at Mickey's was supposed to be his last surveillance before they moved in for arrests. If I just minded my own business, just ignored that feeling in my gut, Michael Patterson would have gone home to his family that night. Jake and Emma would still have their father, Lisa would still have her husband, and I would be home with Sarah and Emily instead of writing this in a cell that smells like bleach and broken dreams. But you can't undo a trigger pull. You can't take back 3 seconds that change everything. You can only lie here in the dark, listening to Rodriguez snore and count the days until you stop feeling like the worst person who ever lived. 23 years, 4 months, and 16 days to go. But who's counting? The letters stopped coming after 18 months. First, Sarah's letters became shorter, then they came less frequently, then they stopped altogether. The last one was just 3 lines on notebook paper. "Marcus, I can't do this anymore. Emily and I are moving to Oregon to live with my sister. Don't try to find us. I'm sorry. No, I love you. No, I'll wait for you. Just sorry and goodbye." I read that letter so many times the paper started to fall apart along the creases. I kept it in my Bible, not because I was reading the Bible then, but because it seemed like the safest place to keep something that was killing me slowly. The chaplain, Father Mackenzie, a soft-spoken man with kind eyes and calloused hands, had given me the Bible during my first week. I'd taken it to be polite, but it had just sat on my shelf collecting dust while my life collected regrets. The silence that followed Sarah's last letter was different from the everyday noise of prison. This was the silence of abandonment, of doors closing that would never open again, of a future that had been erased like chalk from a blackboard. I stopped eating regular meals, stopped showing up for work detail, stopped caring about anything except the growing hollow feeling in my chest. Rodriguez noticed first. One morning, instead of his usual grunt of acknowledgement, he actually looked at me, really looked at me, and what he saw must have worried him. "Hey, Brooklyn," he said, his voice rougher than sandpaper from too many cigarettes. "You look like death, man. When's the last time you showered?" I couldn't remember. Days blended together when you stopped caring about tomorrow. The smell of my own body had become just another layer of misery to ignore. "What's it matter?" I mumbled, staring at the ceiling where those 3 words, "God sees everything," seemed to mock me daily. "And it matters because you're starting to smell like the guy in Block C who died last month, and nobody found him for 3 days. Rodriguez sat up on his bunk, and I could feel his eyes on me. "Talk to me, man. What's eating you?" So I told him about Sarah, about Emily, about the letter that had ripped what was left of my heart clean out of my chest. Rodriguez listened without interrupting, occasionally nodding like he understood the weight of losing everything that mattered. When I finished, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My Maria left me after 10 years inside, took our boys to Phoenix. Haven't heard from them since." We sat in silence after that, 2 broken men in a concrete box, sharing the kind of pain that has no words. The next few months were the darkest period of my incarceration. Without the thin thread of hope that Sarah's letters had provided, I sank into something deeper than depression. I was drowning in my own despair, and I didn't care enough to try swimming to the surface. I started picking fights, small ones at first, bumping into someone in the chow line, taking someone's usual seat in the day room, then bigger ones, until I found myself in the infirmary with a broken nose and 2 black eyes after mouthing off to a lifer named Big Mike, who had fists like hammers and 0 patience for disrespect. The guards put me in solitary for a week after that fight. 23 hours a day in a cell, barely big enough to lie down in, with nothing but my thoughts and the sound of my own breathing for company. The walls were white instead of green, but somehow that made them even more oppressive. White like hospital rooms where people go to die. White like the pages of letters that never came anymore. It was in solitary that I first started talking to myself. Just little things at first, wondering out loud what Emily looked like now, whether she was walking yet, if she'd remember the sound of my voice when she got older. But talking to yourself is a dangerous habit in a place like this, because pretty soon you start answering back. And then you're having full conversations with the empty air, like the crazy guys who rock back and forth in the corners of the day room. The silence in solitary was absolute. No Rodriguez snoring, no guards, radios crackling, no sounds of other inmates living their caged lives. Just me and the white walls, and the growing certainty that I was losing my mind one day at a time. On the 5th day, I started screaming. Not words, just raw sound torn from my throat like strips of flesh. I screamed until my voice gave out. Then I whispered curses at the walls, at God, at Michael Patterson for being in that bathroom, at Sarah for leaving, at myself for being the kind of man who destroys everything he touches. But even screaming gets exhausting eventually. And when my voice was completely gone, the silence rushed back in like water filling a bucket. That's when I heard it, or maybe I imagined it. I'm still not sure. It was the sound of crying, soft and distant, like someone weeping behind a closed door. At first, I thought it was another inmate, maybe in the next cell. But as I listened, I realized the sound wasn't coming from outside at all. It was coming from inside me, from someplace so deep I'd forgotten it existed. I was crying, and I didn't even know why. The tears felt strange on my face, like rain on desert sand. When was the last time I'd cried? Not since I was a kid, maybe not since my father left when I was 12. Taking his cigarette smell and his easy laugh with him and leaving me to become the man of the house before I knew what being a man really meant. I cried for everything I'd lost. Sarah's smile, Emily's first steps that I'd never see, the life I'd thrown away for 3 seconds of stupid pride. I cried for Michael Patterson's kids, for his wife who probably still set a place for him at dinner out of habit. I cried for my own stupidity, for the choice that had turned me into a monster, for the man I could have been if I'd been brave enough to be better than my circumstances. When they let me out of solitary, Rodriguez took one look at me and shook his head. "Man, you look different, older maybe, or sadder, hard to tell which." I felt different too, but not necessarily better. The crying had emptied something out of me, but it hadn't filled the space with anything useful. I was still alone, still guilty, still counting down the days in a life sentence that felt longer than eternity. That night, lying on my thin mattress and staring up at those 3 words scratched into the ceiling, I finally understood what the silence had been trying to tell me. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the absence of hope, of connection, of any reason to believe that tomorrow might be different from today. In that silence, I was dying 1 minute at a time, and nobody, not Rodriguez, not Father Mackenzie, not even God, if he was really watching, could save me from drowning in my own despair. Or so I thought. Winter came early that year, creeping through the walls like a living thing with ice in its veins. The heating system in our block was ancient and temperamental, cycling between blazing hot and freezing cold without warning or pattern. Some nights we'd wake up in pools of sweat, other nights we'd huddle under every blanket we owned and still shiver until morning. It was during one of those bitter, cold nights in January that everything finally broke apart inside me. I'd been having the dream again, the same one that visited me at least 3 times a week. In it, I'm back in Mickey's bathroom. But this time, Detective Patterson isn't reaching for his gun. This time, he's reaching for a photograph in his wallet, and he's saying something about his kids, something about how his daughter Emma just lost her first tooth and his son Jake made the Little League team. In the dream, I can see their faces in the photograph. Gap-toothed Emma with pigtails and freckles, Jake in a baseball uniform 3 sizes too big. Both of them grinning at the camera with the pure joy that only children possess. And Patterson is smiling too, the proud father showing off his babies to a stranger in a bathroom, never knowing that the stranger has a gun, never suspecting that he has 30 seconds left to live. But in this version of the dream, I don't pull the gun. Instead, I listen to him talk about his kids, and then I walk out of that bathroom, leaving him alive to go home to them. I walk out of Mickey's, drive home to Sarah, and hold her close while our unborn daughter kicks against her belly, and none of the horrible things that followed ever happen. I always wake up from that dream with tears on my face and a pain in my chest so sharp it feels like someone's driving nails into my heart. This particular night was worse than usual, maybe because the cold made everything hurt more. Or maybe because it was the 2-year anniversary of Sarah's last letter, and I'd been thinking about Emily, wondering if she was talking now, if she'd learned to say "Daddy" to some other man. Rodriguez was sick that week, some kind of flu that was making its way through the prison like wildfire, so he was in the infirmary, leaving me alone in the cell for the first time in months. The solitude should have been a relief, but instead it felt like being buried alive. The walls seemed closer than usual, and that scratched message on the ceiling, "God sees everything," felt like an accusation rather than a comfort. I couldn't get warm no matter what I did. Even with both blankets wrapped around me, the cold seeped through the concrete and into my bones until I felt like I was freezing from the inside out. My teeth were chattering so hard I was afraid I'd chip one. And my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't even hold a book steady enough to read. That's when I started talking to him, to Detective Michael Patterson, as if he was sitting right there in Rodriguez's empty bunk. listening to my midnight confessions. "I'm sorry," I whispered into the dark. "God, Michael, I'm so sorry. I think about you every day. I think about your kids, your wife, what they must have gone through. I think about how scared you must have been in those last seconds, how confused you must have been about why this was happening." The silence that followed felt like judgment, heavy and absolute. I pulled the blankets tighter around me, but they might as well have been made of paper for all the warmth they provided. "I was scared too," I continued, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I was just a punk kid who thought he was tough, but I was scared all the time. Scared of being weak, scared of being poor, scared of ending up like my old man who ran away when things got hard. So I tried to be harder than everyone else, meaner than everyone else, and look where it got me." The cold seemed to be getting worse, settling into my lungs until each breath felt like swallowing ice. I started shivering so violently that I couldn't control it, and my vision began to blur at the edges. Maybe I was getting the same flu that had taken down Rodriguez, or maybe this was something else entirely. The body finally giving up after the mind had checked out months ago. "I wish I could trade places with you," I said, and meant it with every fiber of my being. You had people who loved you, people who needed you. Your kids needed their father, and I took that away from them. I took everything away from them. And for what? Because I was too proud and too stupid to mind my own business. The shivering got worse, my whole body convulsing like I was having some kind of seizure. I tried to stand up, thinking maybe I should call for the guard, but my legs wouldn't support me. I collapsed back onto the bunk, and that's when the real terror set in. I was dying. I could feel it happening, feel my body shutting down one system at a time. My heart was racing and stumbling like a broken engine, and my breathing was becoming shallow and irregular. The cold wasn't coming from outside anymore. It was radiating from somewhere deep inside me, like my soul was turning to ice. "I don't want to die," I gasped, the words barely forming through my chattering teeth. "Not like this, not without making things right somehow. Please, somebody help me, please." But who was going to help me? Rodriguez was sick. The guards didn't make their rounds for another 2 hours. And God, if he really did see everything, had been watching me suffer for 2 years without so much as a whisper of comfort. I was alone, and I was dying. And there was nothing I could do about it except lie there and wait for the cold to finish what my guilt had started. That's when I broke, not just emotionally, but something deeper, something fundamental that had been holding me together despite everything finally snapped like an overstretched rubber band. I started sobbing, great racking sobs that shook my entire body and made the shivering even worse. "Jesus!" I cried out, the name torn from somewhere so deep I didn't even know it existed. "Jesus, if you're real, if you're listening, please help me. I can't do this anymore. I can't carry this alone. I'm drowning, and I don't know how to swim." The words surprised me even as I said them. I hadn't prayed since I was a kid, hadn't called on Jesus for anything except as a curse word. But here I was, crying out to him like a child lost in the dark, begging for salvation I didn't deserve from a God I'd ignored for most of my life. "I killed a good man," I whispered, my voice breaking on every word. "I destroyed lives, including my own. I don't deserve forgiveness. I don't deserve mercy. But please, please don't let me die like this. Please help me find a way to make something good come from all this evil." The cold was so intense now that I could see my breath, and my lips were starting to feel numb. I pulled the blankets over my head and curled into a ball, trying to conserve what little body heat I had left, and I kept praying, begging really, for some kind of miracle, some kind of sign that I wasn't completely alone in this concrete tomb. And then, just as I felt consciousness starting to slip away, something changed. I can't explain it rationally, can't prove it happened, but suddenly the air in the cell felt different, warmer somehow, but not just physically warm. It felt peaceful, like a gentle hand had been placed on my shoulder, like a voice had whispered, "I hear you, son. I've been waiting for you to call my name." The shivering stopped, the cold receded, and for the first time in 2 years, I felt something other than despair. I felt hope. I woke up the next morning covered in sweat instead of shivering from cold, with sunlight streaming through the high window in a way I'd never noticed before. For a moment, I thought the events of the night had been just another dream, another torture session courtesy of my guilty subconscious. But as I sat up and looked around the cell, everything seemed different somehow. Brighter, cleaner. Like someone had washed the despair off the walls while I slept. Rodriguez returned from the infirmary that afternoon, looking pale and 10 pounds lighter, but grateful to be back in familiar misery rather than the white-walled uncertainty of the medical wing. He took one look at me and frowned. "Brooklyn, what happened to you? You look, I don't know, different, less dead maybe." I tried to explain what had happened. "But how do you describe a miracle to someone who's forgotten that miracles exist?" The words came out clumsy and inadequate, like trying to paint a sunset with a broken crayon. But Rodriguez listened, nodding occasionally. And when I finished, he was quiet for a long time. "My grandmother used to say that sometimes God waits until we're completely empty before he starts filling us up again," he finally said. "Said it was like trying to pour water into a cup that's already full. You got to empty it out first, even if the emptying hurts worse than the filling feels good." That night, I opened the Bible Father Mackenzie had given me. I'd looked at it hundreds of times over the past 2 years, had even used it as a coaster for my coffee cup on more than one occasion, but I'd never actually read any of it. The pages were thin and whisper soft, and they fell open to a passage that made my hands shake. "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." I read those words over and over until they were burned into my memory like a brand. Labor and heavy laden. That was me, all right, carrying the weight of Michael Patterson's death, Sarah's abandonment, Emily's lost future, and my own stupidity like stones in a backpack that got heavier with every step. But rest. I'd forgotten what rest felt like. Even sleep brought no peace, only nightmares and regret. But Jesus was offering something different, not just sleep, but actual rest for the soul. I started reading more, not with any kind of system or plan, just randomly turning pages and reading whatever passages caught my eye. Some of it I didn't understand, some of it seemed harsh and judgmental, but scattered throughout were these moments of incredible grace and mercy that took my breath away. The story of the thief on the cross especially got to me. Here was a guy who'd lived his whole life as a criminal, dying next to Jesus and asking for mercy in his final moments. And Jesus, instead of listing all the reasons why this thief didn't deserve forgiveness, simply said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." No conditions, no probation period, no requirement to somehow make up for a lifetime of wrong choices, just mercy, pure and simple, offered to a dying criminal who had nothing to offer in return. If Jesus could forgive a thief with his dying breath, maybe, just maybe, there was hope for me too. I started going to chapel services on Sunday mornings. Father Mackenzie was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and a voice that somehow managed to carry hope even in the concrete hopelessness of Riverside Correctional. His sermons weren't fire and brimstone. They were gentle invitations to lay down burdens that were too heavy to carry alone. The chapel itself was nothing special. Folding chairs arranged in rows facing a simple wooden cross, fluorescent lights humming overhead, walls painted the same institutional green as everywhere else in the prison. But when 30 or 40 broken men gathered there each Sunday morning, something happened that I can only describe as transformation. Not miraculous or instant, but real nonetheless. I started sitting in the back row, still not sure I belonged there, still convinced that my crime was too big for forgiveness. But I listened to the hymns, old songs about amazing grace and peace in the valley, and I heard men's voices that had screamed curses and threats in the yard, now raised in tentative praise. After my third Sunday, Father Mackenzie approached me after the service. "Marcus," he said, his voice kind but direct, "I see something different in your eyes. Not peace yet, but maybe the beginning of hope. Would you like to talk?" We started meeting once a week in his small office next to the chapel. It was barely bigger than my cell, with a desk made from plywood and cinder blocks, 2 folding chairs, and a window that looked out on the exercise yard where men walked in circles like caged animals. But Father Mackenzie had filled it with books and photos and small touches of humanity that made it feel like a sanctuary. He didn't try to convince me that what I'd done wasn't that bad, didn't offer easy absolution or cheap grace. Instead, he listened as I told him about that night in Mickey's bathroom, about the choice that had destroyed so many lives, about the guilt that was eating me alive from the inside out. "Guilt can be a gift," he said after I finished my story. "It means your conscience is still working, that you understand the weight of what you've done. But guilt without grace becomes a prison worse than any physical cell. It locks you away from forgiveness, from healing, from the possibility of becoming more than the worst thing you've ever done." "But how can I be forgiven for taking a life?" I asked. The question that had been haunting me for 3 years finally spoken out loud. How can there be grace for something like murder?" Father Mackenzie was quiet for a long time, looking out the window at the men walking their endless circles in the yard. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but steady. "The same way there's grace for anything else, not because we deserve it, but because God loves us too much to let us stay trapped in our worst moments. The cross isn't just for small sins, Marcus. It's for the big ones too. The ones that seem unforgivable, the ones that we use to convince ourselves we're beyond redemption." He opened his Bible to a passage in Romans and read, "But God demonstrates his own love for us in this. While we were still sinners, Christ died for us." "While we were still sinners," he repeated, "not after we cleaned up our act, not after we proved we deserved it, but while we were still broken and guilty and covered in shame. That's when he died for us." I went back to my cell that night, with those words echoing in my mind. While we were still sinners, while I was still a killer, still a destroyer of lives, still the man who had stolen Jake and Emma Patterson's father from them, even then, Jesus had died for me. The thought was almost too big to hold, like trying to cup the ocean in my hands. But for the first time since that night in Mickey's bathroom, I felt something stirring in my chest that wasn't guilt or anger or despair. I felt forgiveness beginning to take root in the frozen ground of my heart. Spring came late that year, but when it finally arrived, even the grey walls of Riverside Correctional couldn't completely block out the evidence of new life trying to push through winter's grip. I could see it in the small window of our cell, the bare branches of a single tree visible in the distance, starting to show the faintest hint of green, like hope whispering its way back into a world that had seemed permanently dead. I'd been meeting with Father Mackenzie for 3 months by then, and the weekly conversations were slowly peeling back layers of guilt and self-hatred that had calcified around my heart like concrete. It wasn't easy work. Some days I felt like we were performing surgery without anesthesia, cutting into wounds that had been festering for years. But gradually, painfully, I was beginning to understand the difference between regret and repentance, between self-pity and genuine sorrow for the harm I'd caused. The real breakthrough came on a Tuesday afternoon in April. I was sitting in the day room, reading my Bible, a habit that still drew curious looks from some of the other inmates, when a new prisoner was brought through. He was young, maybe 22 or 23, with the same cocky swagger I'd worn when I first arrived. The guards were processing him, and I could hear fragments of conversation, something about armed robbery, about a convenience store clerk who'd been shot. about a family destroyed by one night of bad choices. Watching him, I saw myself 3 years earlier, angry, defiant, convinced that the world was against him and that he was the victim of circumstances beyond his control. The sight made my stomach clench with recognition and sorrow. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the new arrival. His story was different from mine in the details, but the core was exactly the same. A young man who'd made a choice that couldn't be unmade, who'd hurt people who didn't deserve it, whose life was now measured in years behind bars instead of dreams coming true. I thought about Detective Michael Patterson's children. Jake would be 9 now. Emma would be 7, old enough to understand that their father wasn't coming home, old enough to carry their own scars from that night in Mickey's bathroom. And somewhere in Oregon, my own daughter Emily was growing up without knowing she had a father, probably calling another man daddy, and never knowing that her real father thought about her every single day. The weight of all that broken innocence, all those shattered dreams, hit me like a physical blow. I found myself on my knees beside my bunk, not because I'd planned to pray, but because my legs had simply given out under the crushing realization of how much pain my actions had caused. "God," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "And I need to understand how to carry this. I can accept that you've forgiven me. I'm starting to believe that's possible. But how do I live with what I've done? How do I find meaning in a life that's caused so much destruction?" The answer didn't come in words, at least not at first. Instead, it came as a memory. Something Father Mackenzie had said weeks earlier that I hadn't fully understood at the time. "Sometimes," he'd told me, "the most profound ministry comes from our deepest wounds. The people who've been broken in the same way you've been broken. They're the ones who need to hear your story. Not the sanitized version, not the version that makes you look better than you are, but the real story of how grace can reach even into the darkest places." As that memory settled into my heart, I began to see a possibility I'd never considered before. Maybe my story, as ugly and painful as it was, could serve a purpose beyond just being a cautionary tale. Maybe it could be a bridge between someone else's despair and the kind of hope I was just beginning to experience. The next morning, I asked Father Mackenzie if I could talk to the new arrival. "His name is Devon Matthews," Father Mackenzie said. "And yes, I think that might be exactly what he needs. But Marcus, are you sure you're ready for this? Sharing your story, especially with someone who's walking the same path you walked. It's going to bring up a lot of painful memories." I'd been thinking about that all night. "Father, I've been running from those memories for 3 years, and all it's done is make them stronger. Maybe it's time to stop running and start using them for something good." Devon Matthews was sitting alone in the corner of the day room when I approached him, his body language screaming, "Stay away," to anyone who might be thinking about offering unwanted advice or false comfort. He looked up when I sat down across from him, his eyes hard and suspicious. "I don't need a welcoming committee," he said, his voice carrying the same bitter edge I recognized from my own early days. "Good," I replied, "because I'm not here to welcome you to anything. This place sucks. Your life sucks right now. And anybody who tries to tell you different is either lying or crazy." That got his attention. He studied my face, looking for the angle, the manipulation, the hidden agenda that everyone in here was supposed to have. "So what do you want?" he asked. "To tell you that it doesn't have to stay this way forever," I said. "The sucking part, I mean. The bars are still going to be here. The food's still going to taste like cardboard. And the guards are still going to treat you like a number instead of a human being. But the part of you that's dying inside, that part can heal." Over the next hour, I told Devon my story. All of it. The night at Mickey's, The choice that destroyed everything, the years of guilt and anger and despair that followed. I told him about Sarah leaving, about Emily growing up without me, about the nights when I wanted to die more than I wanted to breathe. But I also told him about that cold night in January when everything broke open, about finding hope in the last place I'd expected to look, about discovering that even a killer could be forgiven if he was willing to stop defending his actions long enough to truly repent of them. Devon listened without interrupting, and by the time I finished, his hard mask had slipped just enough for me to see the scared kid underneath. "So what are you saying?" he asked quietly. "That I should find Jesus and everything will be okay." "I'm saying that Jesus found me when I was too broken to look for him," I replied. "And no, everything's not okay. I'm still in prison, I'm still separated from my daughter, and Detective Patterson is still dead because of my choices, but I'm not drowning anymore, Devon. For the first time in 3 years, I can breathe without it hurting." We talked for another hour, and when Devon finally went back to his cell, I could see something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. Not peace, not yet, but maybe the beginning of hope. The same hope that had been growing in me, one painful day at a time. That night, as I lay on my bunk listening to Rodriguez snore and staring up at those 3 words scratched into the ceiling, "God sees everything," they no longer felt like an accusation. They felt like a promise. God saw everything, including the mess I'd made of my life. But he also saw the possibility of redemption, the chance for even the worst mistakes to become part of a story that pointed toward grace instead of despair. I was beginning to understand that my sentence wasn't just punishment. It was also preparation. Every day behind these walls was another day to learn how to carry my guilt without being crushed by it, how to find meaning in suffering, how to become the kind of man who could help other broken people find their way toward healing. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but maybe it was the life God could use. And for the first time since that night in Mickey's bathroom, that was enough. 5 years into my sentence, I started writing letters I never intended to mail. They were exercises in honesty, attempts to put into words all the things I should have said before my choices made saying them impossible. I wrote to Sarah, to Emily, to Detective Patterson's family, and even to the man I used to be, the cocky kid from Brooklyn who thought he was smarter than consequences. The letter to Sarah was the hardest. How do you apologize to someone for destroying their dreams? How do you explain that love isn't enough when it comes wrapped in violence and selfishness? I wrote 17 versions of that letter, each one ending up crumpled in the trash can beside my desk in the prison library where I'd started volunteering, helping other inmates learn to read. "Dear Sarah," the final version began, "I know you'll never read this, and that's probably for the best, but I need to tell you that I understand why you left, and I'm grateful that you were strong enough to build a new life for yourself and Emily. You deserved a husband who protected you instead of destroying everything you loved. I'm sorry I wasn't that man, and I pray that whoever Emily calls Daddy now loves you both the way I should have learned to love." The letter to Emily was different, shorter, but somehow more devastating to write. What do you say to a daughter who doesn't know you exist? How do you compress a lifetime of love and regret into words on a page? "My beautiful daughter," I wrote, "by the time you're old enough to understand this letter, you'll be a grown woman with a life I can only imagine. I want you to know that not a day passes that I don't think about you, wonder what you look like, what makes you laugh, what dreams fill your heart. I made choices that stole your father from you, and I'm sorrier about that than I have words to express, but I want you to know that you were loved, even by a man you never knew. You were loved completely, perfectly and forever." But the most important letter, the one that took me 3 months to write, was addressed to Jake and Emma Patterson. I'd learned more about their father over the years. Detective Michael Patterson had coached Little League on weekends, volunteered at a food bank on Thursday nights, and never missed his daughter's dance recitals. His fellow officers remembered him as the kind of cop who carried dog biscuits in his patrol car for the strays he encountered, who knew every kid in his neighborhood by name, who'd rather talk a situation down than escalate it. The more I learned about the man I'd killed, the more I understood what the world had lost that night in Mickey's bathroom. "Dear Jake and Emma," the letter began, "my name is Marcus Thompson, and I am the man who killed your father. I know that nothing I can say will bring him back or heal the wound his loss created in your lives, but I need you to know that I think about him every day, and about both of you, and about the life you should have had with him. Your father was a good man trying to do a dangerous job, and he died because I was young and scared and made a terrible choice in a moment of panic. I've spent the last 5 years learning to live with that choice, learning to carry the weight of what I took from your family without being crushed by it. I don't expect forgiveness. I'm not even sure I deserve it. But I want you to know that your father's death wasn't meaningless, even though it was senseless. It changed me in ways I'm still discovering. It taught me the true cost of violence, the ripple effects of anger, and the preciousness of life. I wish I'd learned these lessons some other way, but since I didn't, I'm trying to make sure his death serves some purpose beyond just destroying lives. I work with young men in here, men who are walking the same path I walked, making the same mistakes I made. I tell them your father's story, not to make them feel guilty, but to help them understand that their choices affect real people, real families, real children who deserve to grow up with their parents. Some of them listen, some of them change. And when that happens, I like to think that maybe your father's life is still making a difference in the world. I know this letter might cause you more pain, and I'm sorry for that too, but I needed you to know that the man who took your father from you has been forever changed by what he did. I needed you to know that I remember your father not just as my victim, but as your hero. And I needed you to know that if there's any way for me to honor his memory through how I live the rest of my life, I'm going to spend every day trying to find it. I sealed that letter in an envelope and put it in my Bible next to the crumbling remains of Sarah's final letter to me. I didn't send it. Maybe I never will. But writing it had accomplished something important. It had helped me transform my guilt from a destructive force into something that could serve a purpose. Rodriguez noticed the change immediately. "Brooklyn," he said one evening as we sat in our cell, "That you're different lately. Still serious, but not so, what's the word? Not so haunted, maybe." He was right. The ghosts of my past were still there, still part of me, but they'd stopped being tormentors and started being teachers. Every night when I looked up at those 3 words, scratched into the ceiling, "God sees everything," I felt not condemnation, but comfort. God saw everything, including the slow work of redemption happening in a concrete cell in upstate New York. He saw Devon Matthews, who'd started coming to chapel services and asking hard questions about grace and justice. He saw the teenage kid from Albany who'd stopped by my desk in the library, wanting to learn to read so he could write letters to his own daughter. He saw the small group of inmates who'd started meeting with Father Mackenzie and me on Thursday nights. Wrestling with what it meant to find hope in hopeless circumstances, God saw it all, and somehow, miraculously, he was using even my worst mistake to create something beautiful. The day I finished writing the last letter, a short note to my younger self warning him about the choice that would define his life, I walked out to the exercise yard during free time. The same tree I'd watched through my cell window was now full and green, its branches reaching toward the sky like arms raised in praise. Other inmates walked their circles, lifted weights, played basketball, all of them trapped in bodies that yearned for freedom while learning, slowly and often painfully, that the most important freedom couldn't be taken away by walls and bars. I thought about Detective Michael Patterson, about his children who were now teenagers, about Sarah and Emily starting their lives over in Oregon. I thought about the man I'd been 5 years ago, angry, selfish, convinced that the world owed him something, and the man I was becoming, still flawed, still carrying the weight of terrible choices, but no longer drowning in despair. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed too beautiful for a place like this. But beauty has a way of finding us even in the darkest places, I'd learned. Grace has a way of reaching us even when we're sure we're beyond its grasp. Tomorrow would bring another day in this concrete box, another day of counting years instead of dreams. But it would also bring another chance to be useful, another opportunity to take the broken pieces of my life and arrange them into something that might help someone else find their way toward hope. As I walked back toward my cell, I found myself humming one of the hymns from Sunday Chapel, Amazing Grace, the song about being found when you were lost, about being freed from chains, both visible and invisible. I was still in prison, but I was no longer captive, and that, I realized, was its own kind of miracle. Dear listeners, we hope Marcus Thompson's story touched your heart. If you'd like to keep experiencing powerful stories like this, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and tell us in the comments which part moved you the most. Every day we share stories that reveal the depth of life and the human heart. We'll be waiting for you in the comments.